Good afternoon. My name is Ken Randall, and along with my co-host, Kellye Testy, we want to welcome you to the August edition of Live with Kellye and Ken. This is a program that we do monthly. Kellye and I celebrated our one-year anniversary when we broadcast live from SEALS last month, and it's great to have everyone with us. Today's topic is gender equity in the law. It's the perfect day to talk about gender equity because indeed today is Gender Equality Day. So we think about equity as really providing the means toward the end of equality. Kellye and I feel a little bit guilty today because it's so busy for the dean. This is the first week of class for everybody, and yet we thought this was a most important topic. So we want to thank our 4 deans for joining us. Your time is invaluable and we'll be very careful with it. We also want to thank our audience for tuning in. We normally have a couple of hundred people who join us live and then maybe another couple hundred who watch us in archive. So we want to thank our loyal audience. And as you know, you can email us questions. Occasionally you'll see Kellye and me looking down, and that's because we get the questions in a text message. So we're not doing anything except paying attention to your questions. It's my honor to welcome our 4 deans today, and then I'll turn it over to Kellye. Dean Jane Aiken, the new dean of Wake Forest, a longtime legal educator from Georgetown. Dean Risa Goluboff of the University of Virginia Law School, who's also a legal historian. So on the 19th Amendment issues, we know you'll have some especially interesting things for us. Dean Tamara Lawson of St. Thomas in Miami, who's actually told me, I'm going to ruin this, that her mother is with her in a room who's celebrating an 84th birthday with her. So we want to welcome your mother as well. Wonderful to have both of you with us. And then finally, Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig of Boston University. Angela, great to have you with us. I was on your campus last week. You were traveling, but so good to be back with colleagues and friends. So Kellye, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken. And deans, I want to join Ken in thanking you for being with us. And likewise, thanking you for your great service to legal education. I'm really glad you're all in the roles that you're in and appreciate you engaging in this conversation with us today. When we think about this being the 100th anniversary of the right to vote, and then think about all that's happening in the world, there's of course so many directions we could take this conversation. So I thought it might be great for us to open up with asking each of you just to share a couple of minutes of reflection to open about some of the things that are top of your minds today when you think about gender equity in law and in our society. And Dean Lawson, I think I'll start with you, and we'll go from there to engage in this conversation. And again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited about today and our panel and the things that we're going to be able to discuss. But I think because my family comes from the South, I think about 100 years ago, what was the top job, someone in my family, a woman in my family could have had, and it definitely wasn't the dean of a law school. And it definitely wasn't a member of a desegregated educational opportunity at all. So I think, as we look back and we look forward, we have to realize that integration of all types is really key to our educational environment. And we have to be disruptors in bias in our daily walk on campus.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dean Goluboff?
Sure. So I've been thinking a lot about this lately because it's not only the centennial of suffrage, but closer to home at UVA, it's the centennial, next year is the centennial of our own coeducation. So the first woman student arrived at UVA in 1920, and it's 70 years since the first African-American student arrived at UVA, like Tamara in the South. And so I've been thinking about those milestones, especially in the context of our bicentennial. So our law school has been around 200 years, suffrage for 100, and coeducation for 100, and racial integration for 70. And so when I think about that, I think exactly what Tamara was talking about, enormous change going forward since, our law school was founded in who we educate. And we now educate the entire swath of the US population. People come from around the world, whereas once upon a time it was incredibly exclusive as to who we educated. And the second thing I'll say, because Ken mentioned my historian's background, one of the things that was key to thinking about civil rights, both during the Reconstruction debates when women tried to get suffrage and failed, and also later when they did manage it, was this kind of idea that there are different kinds of rights. There are political rights, there are economic rights, there are social and cultural rights. And I think when the 19th Amendment came, I think that a lot of the suffrage advocates thought they were starting with political rights, and getting political rights would enable women to then have also economic rights, social rights, cultural rights. And, I think we know 100 years down the line that nothing inevitably follows anything else. And it takes an incredible amount of work. I mean, certainly there's universal women's suffrage today, but even universal women's suffrage didn't come in 1920. It didn't come until after African-American civil rights in the 1960s. But even once you get suffrage, we still don't have, equal representation in our political bodies. We clearly still don't have economic and workplace equality. And there's clearly still a lot of cultural male chauvinism and various kinds of cultural and social power that women are still fighting to get. So like Tamara, I would say, we've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Still a lot of work to do. Dean Willig, let me go north to Boston and hear your opening reflections.
Well, I think both Dean Lawson and Dean Goluboff said a lot of what I think is really important to say. When I think about 100 years from now and today, 100 years ago, what someone who looks like me might be doing and what I'm doing today, it's been enormous change. And at the same time, I think that there's been little change in a wide variety of ways, including in our own profession, right? So I think one thing that continues to plague women, and in particular women of color, is sort of wealth inequality, income inequality, but wealth inequality in particular. And so even if you look even more than 100 years ago and look at who owned most of the wealth and who owns it today, there's been a fraction, a tiny, like less than half of a percentage point change in the distribution of that wealth. And so that impacts so much, including access to education and access to higher education, so many things, access to owning homes, all those things. And then I would say the other thing that really is on my mind a lot is turn more towards our profession, is sort of structures that keep inequality in our profession, that maintain it, that don't allow for things to change, the ways in which our entire workplace system is based upon a sort of breadwinner homemaker model that just doesn't match up with most families, and how that really puts a lot of strain on a lot of families and that does not allow for any kind of social or economic mobility.
Great, thank you so much. And Dean Aiken, I want to now get your opening comments and congratulate you on starting your deanship there at Wake Forest. We're happy to have you in our ranks.
Thank you. Well, I actually, the things that have already been said are things that I was thinking about, but I'm new to deaning, and I'm drawing on some of the things that I've been most recently exposed to. And I taught a class called Motherhood in the Law last spring, and I had 27 young women in my class, none of whom had had children. And so I said to them, well, why are you in this class? And they all said, when do I have a child? How do I negotiate my life as a lawyer? How do I become a partner if I want to have children? So all of that wealth that is unpaid labor, we can't imagine moving forward in wealth as long as there's that much unpaid labor, and that lack of an ability to sort of see your way through, because the expectations are that women will be, self-sacrificing, and that the women will carry this, and that is forever. And that, I think, underlies a lot of what is holding us back and has been holding us back forever.
Well, thank you all for those opening comments. Really appreciate it. And it shows in large part how many directions we can take this conversation. I always like to say that when you don't know where to start, always start with your students and think about them first. So I want to get your thoughts on, many of you are welcoming new classes right now for this year. So you have 1Ls beginning. And of course, this is starting to be the time when students begin thinking about applying to law school for next year as well. And so I want to begin, Risa, with you and ask for some reflections on, when you welcome your new students, when you're thinking about encouraging other women to come to law school, what are some of the key messages you think are important to convey with regard to gender equity in law today?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this. You asked a series of questions for our preparation about current students and then graduates. And, I think a lot of the messages I have are fairly similar to each other for all those different categories of people. And I think, the first thing to say is, if you've been accepted to law school, you belong at law school. So don't question that, right? And thinking about imposter syndrome, don't spend your time in law school wondering if you should be there. You've been accepted, you should be there, assume it, feel entitled to it in a positive way, and then move on from there. The second thing I often tell our students is that, there's a lot of talk of mentorship, and I think mentorship is incredibly important, and it's important to, create relationships with people who can give you advice and who've been where you've been. In addition, I think there's an incredibly important role for sponsorship, and that sponsors are a little bit different from mentors. Mentors are people you go to and they give you advice, and sponsors are people who have their own capital and they use their capital on your behalf, and how important it is to create relationships with people who believe in you and are willing to do that for you. And, I often talk to the students about, well, they ask us, how do you get a sponsor or how do you get a mentor? And, I think the key is to engage, to raise your hand, to participate in class, to seek out faculty members, to create those kinds of relationships, to show what you have to offer and what you can do, and not only to think that sponsors and mentors can come from people who look like you. There's lots of data out there that show that people are more likely to mentor people who look like them and more likely to promote them, but that's not always the case, and we shouldn't assume that that's the case, and especially given that there are disparities in on faculties and in the profession of who is who are in positions of power. We can't assume that that's the case, because we're never going to make any progress. So I think, casting a net widely and sharing your talents with lots of different people so that they can see the talents that you have, those are some concrete things. Like right when you get to law school, I think you start seeing, there are studies about how often women participate and volunteer, and they take themselves out of law review, or they take themselves out of applying for clerkships or applying to other prestigious jobs. And I think encouraging them not to count themselves out and to assume that they belong, and to figure out how to get there and to give them the steps for how to get there.
Great advice. Dean Willig, I see that you're nodding along on some of those comments. Do you want to add to that? Any advice in addition to that you would give your current students?
I would absolutely echo everything that Dean Goluboff said. It's really interesting that you asked this question, because when I was in law school, there was an article that came out called Becoming Gentlemen. And it was about, women and men coming in with sort of equal credentials, and the changes that happened between women and men, and that men really received a lot of the goodies. So I would really echo everything. Don't take yourself out of the running for anything, right? That you've got to, you can't get anything that you don't apply for or throw your hat in the ring for, is one of the things that I always tell students. But I think the other thing is to say that, the world hasn't necessarily caught up with where you are in terms of what you think about gender equity, or even what your generation thinks about gender equity and balance, and that they shouldn't be discouraged or allow themselves to be discouraged, and to keep up the fight, right, in a way when they're resisting and pushing for things to change. They're going to get a lot of pushback, but that they should really hold on to who they are and what they believe, and really continue to push despite the pushback that they get. The other thing, as I try to say to women as they come in, is about allyship and being supportive of one another, right? And so I think there are all kinds of ways in which students can be supportive of one another, whether it be that, you know, there's a sensitive topic that comes up in class and you might have a gender divide on how people see a particular issue. When you see one person speak up and say something and put themselves out of the, out there, don't leave her hanging out there. Don't leave other women hanging out there. Support them, back them up. There's a way in which you can work together to make your experience in law school, which can feel alienating at times, make it feel like a much more supportive environment. Is one of the things that I would say as well. And then the other thing is I would say is, and it's sort of advice about understanding. Advice about understanding how people see you, what stereotypes get imposed upon women. And I say this to students of color too, right? It's going back to Du Bois' double consciousness. It's about understanding what people see and how they might be thinking about you, what shortcuts, what stereotypes they might be imposing, and being aware of them as you take acts. It doesn't mean that it's fair that you have to understand that and then respond and react to it. But just being aware of that, I think, makes people know that sometimes just because so-and-so is doing this doesn't mean that you can also do it and get away with it. You can resist it, you can challenge it, but understanding that and understanding and barriers that might arise if you're not aware and acting on that awareness is really important.
Good, thank you so much. Dean Aiken, you want to follow that up?
Well, one of the things I say to students is that lawyers are problem solvers, and our experience really defines how we think through problem solving. And so bringing a different approach or bringing different experience or coming from a place where you think other people haven't come from is actually a strength. It opens the doors to new ideas. It helps you articulate harms that maybe others haven't recognized as harms because you have an experience that others don't have. So embracing that and owning it and knowing, and women and people of color come with experiences that white men don't have, and that is an advantage if you're going to be an effective problem solver.
Very good, thank you. And Dean Lawson, I want to join my partner Ken in wishing your mother a particularly happy birthday. It was such a pleasure to meet her recently, and I want to ask you to comment on this. I know you give so many students advice.
Well, I did my welcome to the students with a whole section on being prepared, and I talked about how Olympians, they have this extreme talent and extreme skill, but still they prepare and they practice daily, and they practice hard, and they practice to win. And I think we need to talk to our female lawyers about practicing to win. And in that area, I would say to them, be bold, that we fought for our seat at the table to actually voice our unique input that was just mentioned, and to be strong enough to really do that when you're in a room where maybe you are the only person that looks like you, or the only person that has the perspective that you have, but also at the same time be open to your colleagues where this might be a new voice, entirely new experience for them interacting with you, and to be patient in that collaborative exchange that we're all working through to improve our legal profession. And then in the preparation, I had a very successful female lawyer share this anecdote. She says, "Sweetie, don't buy shoes. Spend your money on a good support team." And those of you that know me, that's like really something to tell me not to buy shoes. But she was really right. She was talking about that support team that women need, because we can't do actually everything at the same time. So you need that support team at home, depending on your family life, to support your children, to support, maybe cooking dinner a few nights a week and doing those things, but also to support your professional development. To spend a little extra money on yourself in that enterprise as well, and not just be wedded to your employer's budget, but really value yourself, that you're going to spend time in developing yourself and your leadership and all of your skills. And if you can't find the training, maybe build your own and build your own support team to help you get to the next level. Be prepared in all these ways to map out the steps of your future, because no one else is planning your success. If you don't take time for it, no one else is actually expecting you maybe to succeed when we talk about gender and intersectionality and different roles. So we have to be confident enough to share that message with our colleagues that we are here and we're here to succeed and we're here to work collectively to advance the institution and to advance the profession.
Thank you all. I wish I could time travel and go back and be students in each of your law schools. That would I would do that in a heartbeat. Let me ask you a question from a law school candidate standpoint. You know, working with the Law School Admission Council, we obviously are working hard to encourage people to think about law school and help ease their journey into law school. And sometimes we'll have female students ask us whether we think there are particular pathways that are better for women to think about or not so good for women to think about. So I want to ask some of you to comment on that question of, you know, are there particular aspects of our profession that women should be thinking about as they start their law school journey even? And as you're thinking about that, I want to remind you all that, you know, this year we have 54% of law students that are women, identify as women. And that's interesting in that it's not just this year, but for several years, women have been graduating in almost equal number to men from law school, but yet we still see not that equality when we look out at the profession in terms of associates and particularly partners. So given those, you know, that state of affairs and some of those questions that law school candidates might have, what might your advice be for those thinking about a career in law? Anything in particular that you would like to call out for attention? And Dean Willig, let me start with you this time.
Yeah, so I guess I would say the first thing I would say is that when you're in law school, you know, really try to focus and stay focused on law school and doing as well as possible and participating in as many things as possible so that you can keep as many options open, right? And then I'm pretty honest. I'm pretty honest in general about, for example, law firms are structured in a way that makes it really, really difficult for women who I think, right, the time at which most of our graduates are going through, if they go to a law firm after law school and they want, let's say they want to become a partner, the time at which you're supposed to be putting in the most time and effort and resources into that job are, number one, the childbearing years for many of our students. It's incredibly grueling. So if somebody wants to chill children, they might be delaying that for a long period of time, or might be doing the job in a structure that is generally, for most law firms, not set up to accommodate a part-time work schedule or accommodate a family of two people who are working full-time in really high-pressure jobs, right? And so I think it's important for women to know that, right? And to make those decisions. And one of the things I say along with that too is also be careful, you know, pick your partner carefully, right? You don't want to pick someone, as Dean Aiken said earlier, who just simply assumes that you're going to make all the sacrifices in your career and they're not going to make any. And so that's part of the decision with law firms. But I mean, there might be some areas that I say work well for women. So I talk about tax. Right? So not tax litigation, but tax and, right? Tax, we talk to tax lawyers, they say they have pretty predictable hours, right? There are no tax emergencies. There are periods of time where tax attorneys are busier than others, but that's something, that's one of the areas, if somebody knows that they want to go to a corporate law firm, that I will highlight. Of course, academia, there's more flexibility. There's still people still working very long hours, the same hours, but there's more flexibility in how you do it and more flexibility in terms of how you manage both what's going on in your home, or if you have children, what's going on with your children. That's another area I would suggest. A lot of government jobs are jobs with more regular hours, or things that I suggest for women who are thinking about, they know they want to have a family and they don't want to spend all their time at work, and they want to be able to see their families. depending upon the type of government job, you might actually have a life in which you can really do that. And so I think it's just important for, I always tell women to try to do as well as you can to keep all your options open, and then weigh what fits into your life. If you think you're going to have a lifetime partner, pick that partner carefully so that you can negotiate those matters. And maybe it's a trade-off. One time you make the sacrifice, and the next time they do. But however you want to do it. But I think in general in our society, work has become really all-encompassing, right? Now we've got all of our cell phones are reachable all the time, and email. I think in a lot of workplaces, people find it hard to not be expected to work 24/7, and so it's not simply only about law, but it's a tough challenge, and I think there are a few places that I would suggest might have better hours than others, but it's tough.
A lot of hours everywhere. That's right. Dean Aiken, your thoughts?
Well, I think women are good at a lot of things. And I completely agree that there are certain professions, for certain areas of law, that lend themselves well to having a little more flexibility if you want to have a home life, if you want to have some sanity, for men and women. But I also think that women multitask very well. I think we've had to. And I think we often don't ask for what we want. And as long as we don't ask for what we want, we won't get it. And the people around us who perceive themselves more powerfully will ask. And so part of what I want my students to do is to realize that they need to take more control over how they want to be in a work environment, and ask for what they want, and to work hard at feeling powerful enough to ask, and to have people around them that support them and help them to frame what those asks are like. Because what I've found is that when you ask, you often get. But I've spent a lot of my life not asking, and I think a lot of women haven't asked as well, and that can make a difference in terms of having an excellent opportunity of work in any field.
That when you ask, you often get. It's a good reminder for all the work deans do in the development realm too, right?
That's exactly right. For sure.
Dean Lawson, some follow-up from your perspective?
Well, in follow-up to both of those comments, I would add fight for good work assignments. Schedule is one thing, and asking, but also be strategic in asking for good work assignments that give you the experience that you can build to the next promotable assignment. And I think that's one thing in the research. They've shown that the assignments are not equally divided among men and women. And if you're only given housekeeping type assignments and not decision-making type assignments, you won't have the appropriate experience for the next promotable job or the next, big thing you want to do. And I think I would concur with the government jobs is one area where you often get an opportunity sooner than in a firm with more hierarchy. You get an opportunity to make decisions on your own cases and on your own files, and it may be an opportunity to really be in charge as a lawyer and practice your skills as a lawyer in various ways. And so you have to be bold and speak up in those areas too, to make sure that you're getting a fair shake on the work and the opportunities.
Very good. Thank you. Dean Goluboff, I want to get you in on this too.
Sure. So building on what everyone else said, one of the things I think about a lot and share with my students who are going out to the work world is that life is dynamic and long and always changing. And my husband, who's also a law professor, he and I teach a class on work-life balance that we've taught for many years together. And so we're teaching third-year students. They're about to go out and have their first jobs. And one of the things we talk about, to build on what some other folks have said, is, life is long. And even if you're aiming for mutuality, intersectionality in your relationship, enabling both partners to have jobs. Not everything has to be mutual at every moment, but you need to make sure that as you negotiate that, it's not listing in one direction and not the other, and that you're both enabling each other to do what you need to do for your professional life and to give each other the opportunities. And you should think about, if you're in a couple, maximizing not only your own career, but maximizing the couple and maximizing what you both want to do individually. And I think that's especially true before you have children. It's hard to figure out, it's hard to know what it's going to look like for the next 20 some odd years of child raising, and not that it ever ends, but it changes immensely. And what your children need from you when they're tiny is different from what they need from you when they're teenagers. And not to think that what you need at time one is what you need at time two. And so when you're asking for what you need, understanding that that is likely to change. And especially if you're thinking about leaving the workforce, making sure that you're thinking about the time when you might want to come back, and are there on-ramps, and how do you access them, and how do you continue to make yourself marketable. And one of the things that I always find a little dispiriting in this class is that we often have more women than men, and it's for the reasons mentioned before. Women are acculturated to the idea that they're going to have to make choices about the relationship between their work and child raising or life outside of work in a way that men often aren't. And so making sure that we're giving these messages to our male students as well as our female students, and that leave is available for men as well as women, and making sure that everybody understands that these negotiations should be about everything, with everything on the table, and going on, over the course of a career. And the last thing I would say, just to build on like how sectors might be different and how different practice areas might be different. Within any sector and within any practice area, there's immense variation. And so I would say, don't just ask once you've gotten into a job. Ask before you get there. What is leave like? Not only is it available, but who takes it? Are men taking it as well as women? Because that gives you a sense of whether women are really expected to bear this extra burden, or whether it's a real culture of equality. Is childcare available? How many women partners are there? What is the culture of the firm like? Are there women who have made partner being part-time? But really trying to suss out from, and that's only in the firm world, obviously in nonprofits and in government, those similar questions can be asked. But trying to figure out, is this a culture for me? And is this a place that wants to see me succeed? And I think for a lot of students or young lawyers, they worry that asking those questions will make employers not want to hire them. And maybe it seems optimistic from the other side, but I would say that's not a club you want to belong to, right? So if they're going to penalize you for asking those questions, then they're not really going to be interested in your, equal thriving and success is my instinct.
Yeah. Could I jump in to add one more point? Even though I advocated for government and we talked about the academia being flexible, the only caveat I would raise is that these are also areas where lawyers are underpaid in comparison to the private market generally, in comparison to the firm. So I think we as women have to be mindful of that, as we know the wage gap exists. And as we navigate that wage gap with both getting good work and good experience, but also getting good compensation for our fair contribution.
Thank you for adding that. It's a really important consideration. And you've all done such a great job of showing in these journeys that there's really you need to navigate both the professional and the personal in some ways to make your way. And I want to ask another question that makes a little more complex our discussion here, that many of you have written and done such good work in your teaching, your scholarship, about issues of intersectionality, of understanding that as people we may have gender, but we also have race and class, and that those intersect in many ways. And then I also want to throw into that the fact that much of the time when we're talking about gender, we want to be careful, and though we often refer to the binary of men and women, we also know that gender is much more complex with that. And I know a lot of our schools are grappling with ways to be more welcoming and supportive of transgender students. or students who may not want to choose one of those binaries. So I wonder if I could ask you all to reflect a little bit about the additional complexity when we talk about gender equity in law that comes from recognition of intersectionality and of the fact that gender isn't that easy binary that we may, wish sometimes to, or may seem to suggest that it is. And I know that's a big question, so I'm going to, let you. I don't know which of you would like to go first with it. I'd rather have you volunteer than to do the Socratic thing on this one. Anybody first?
I'll jump in.
Okay,
A little.
Dean Lawson, go.
One thing I could share as a personal anecdote of being a woman and a woman of color, and the first on my faculty to be tenured and the only one on the voting faculty still. When I started, it was asked of me to teach race in the law. And I pretended I didn't even understand the words. I didn't know what that meant. I'm a former prosecutor. I teach criminal law and criminal procedure. And, I'm happy to teach those things and, anything in the criminal field. But I was cautious about being pigeonholed into a particular limited area. And even having come from the prosecutor's office, I was on the domestic violence team there. And, there was even limits on what cases you could get as a woman. The better you got, well, then you'd get more heinous domestic homicides or crimes against women and children. So I wanted to be treated, at least that's how I navigated it initially, as an equal member of the faculty that taught a doctrinal area of my expertise. And later, of course, as you all know, I do teach race in the law, but I was cautious about being labeled as a sub-faculty member.
Appreciate that. Dean Goluboff, do you want to?
It looked like Dean Willig was about to talk. I'll let her go
Okay,
first.
Dean Willig.
I was going to say there's just so much. It's just so much to talk about. I mean,
there is
so many invisible ways in which I think our society, our profession reinforces all kinds of inequities that are related to many identity characteristics at their intersection, right? So from everything to our expectations around dress and dress codes, right? That certainly it impacts different people differently, right? So expectations about what is professional dress or professional hair, professional, all those things, right? That's very much on the gender binary in terms of what we expect, for example, men and women to wear, and it doesn't leave room for people who are much more gender fluid who might, want to wear different kinds of things, or people who are not gender fluid who want to wear different kinds of things in the work. And we don't ever challenge our perceptions about what professional dress is in general in law, but I mean, from anything to hair, which is going to affect different groups of color in different ways as well, in terms of what's considered to be professional looking hair along those lines. I think we have we talked about mentors earlier, mentors and sponsors. We have a problem in general, is I think that a lot of people in law firms, in law schools, and all kinds of places have not really thought about and learned how to mentor and interact with. And there's a lot of discomfort about interacting with people who are different than they are. And that results in things like what Dean Lawson said, people not getting the choice assignments, or people's work being, because of implicit bias and in some cases conscious bias, being scrutinized more than other people's work as a result of various biases. And if we look at certain studies like the ABA's work, which has revealed that women of color literally leave law schools leave law firms in droves, right? That law firms, women of color come in and leave because it's just completely inhospitable to women of color. And I would imagine even more inhospitable to trans women of color, right? Who are, frankly, murdered far more than any other group in this nation. There's so many things that we talk about academia, from teaching evaluations to, to in all workplaces, issues with negotiation and salary. That's also intersectional. When I talk to, women in general are really reluctant to negotiate, but even more so women of color are even more reluctant to negotiate. And that's in part based upon the ways in which people react to us when we ask for things. But it's also in part, it's in part based upon this notion that a lot of it's based on past experience. How are people responded to when they push or ask for more, or all those things? And so, there's just so many issues. It's hard to imagine where to focus on. That's really my my issue here, and trying to figure out what to say, is that there is just so much that can be said about so many of these issues. Of course, anything that we've been talking about, but there's just so much that's all at the intersection, and not to mention even talk about how wealth impacts access to law schools, access to so many opportunities, and those things, are tied very much to gender and race and sexuality and all those things. So there's just too much to talk about, really.
Yeah. Well, there really is, and there's so many ways into this. Dean Goluboff, you want to follow up from that?
So I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just frame it in a really broad way, which is just to move out from what Dean Willig and Dean Lawson have been talking about. But, so much of this is about stereotypes and about how different groups are perceived and what kinds of expectations there are about them. And it's really hard to combat stereotypes, right? It's not, there are ways of trying, but it is hard. And I think it's where we're still moving. And I've been thinking ever since getting the invitation to be on this program, I've been thinking about, so much has changed over the last 100 years in terms of where women are and women of color and trans people, both trans men and trans women, where we're all able to get access to, although there are still definitely differential aspects of access as well, but that institutions haven't changed as quickly as access into institutions, and assumptions about what people can do once they're in institutions haven't changed as quickly. And so it is still the male breadwinner, female caretaker, homemaker role. It is still assumed that women are not, strong enough as leaders. There's still, all kinds of stereotypes that are following all this diversity that is now among our leadership that makes it hard for people to succeed, whether it be in government and academia, in firms, in nonprofits. And so I think we have to really be thinking about how do we change the structures and how do we change the assumptions. And part of that is changing who's at the top and who the leaders are. But part of it is changing how we think about things, how we do compensation systems, how we think about hiring and recruiting and getting people in the door. On the good news side, I just point out a couple of things that are a little more optimistic. One, we hosted a few weeks ago the second annual Women's Leadership and Legal Education Conference. The University of Georgia hosted the first one, and the numbers of women and women of color and men of color, people of color generally, who are deans of law schools now has just gone up dramatically over the last few years. And so to look around this room of women deans and women leaders and up and coming women leaders was just really transformational and very inspirational that we are moving forward, and the ranks of leadership and the pipelines to leadership are diversifying immensely. So that's one thing I'll say. And then the second I'll say is, even as I believe deeply that that structures and stereotypes and biases need to change, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression, I don't think any of us want to leave anyone with the impression that there's nothing they on an individual level can do about it. At the same time, you don't want to blame victims, right, and say, oh, you can fix this all yourself. You can't. But I do certainly think that finding allies, finding mentors, finding sponsors, advocating for yourself, figuring out what kind of public persona, professional persona you can develop for yourself that enables you to navigate these advocacy and the stereotypes, even though I think, as Dean Willig said before, you know, it's an extra burden and you shouldn't have to have that burden, but you do. And in order to succeed, you've got to figure out how to do that. And I do hope we get to the place where those burdens aren't felt differentially, but we're not there yet. And so, you know, thinking about that, I think, can really help people in their own careers as they go forward.
Thank you so much. And Dean Aiken, I want to get you in on this too. And before I do that, I just want to note that it is important for us not to realize that the access alone is critical, but not enough. And I know I get asked a lot when I'm talking about our own mission at LSAC and otherwise, you know, Kellye, why do you always have to say access and equity and inclusion and diversity? And all those are important, but they really go to different pieces. That you know, access alone is not enough, that we need to make sure that everyone really can thrive once they have access and that we're working toward those equality goals. So thank you for that distinction. And Jane, let me turn to you for any comment on this topic that you may have.
Well, I grew up in the period where feminism was hijacked by straight white women. And what's happening right now is pretty exciting to me because it is so much more complicated, because it goes to really fundamental issues about what do we mean when we say race, what do we mean when we say gender, what do we mean when we say sexuality. All of those things are really fundamental questions. And our students are ready to engage those questions. And those questions teach them a lot about figuring out the world. I mean, it's disorienting and they have to find their way, and that makes people more powerful. That makes people learn how to talk in ways that they've never been asked to talk before. And I think that, and I actually, as a white woman, I feel some obligation to raise it because I have benefits by virtue of my skin color and my wealth. And it makes it easier for me to raise these questions, but these questions offer me an incredible educational opportunity with my students, because when they're disoriented, they're more open to rethinking about the world and coming together. And that's powerful.
It sure is. It's great.
Well, thank Kellye, that the ABA is addressing this too. I think even in its most recent hearing about the ABA requirement on diversity and inclusion, right, and how that is going to be interpreted and defined. You know, that is a requirement of all law schools. So as you said, access is critical, but it's not sufficient. It's also the inclusiveness of the law school environment, not only from the aspect of the student entry and successful transition into the profession, but also from the entry of faculty, which they're now looking to interpret faculty to include all levels of faculty and staff. So that's something to really consider when we talk about equality. Indeed.
Thank you so much. Ken, I want to turn to you. You noted that we have some questions coming in, and you've been, as always, a terrific ally here today. Let me toss it to you to ask anything that our audience may be bringing in, or any questions that you may want to pose.
Great. Well, thanks, Kellye, and Dean's great discussion. I'm going to read the first question, and Dean Willig, I'm going to ask you first to comment because I think it really reminds me of some things you said about having to ask, and how do you really get people to have a voice. So the first question from the audience is, are there tactics that deans should take with their faculties to encourage them to be more inclusive in their classroom approach? So when we think about students who are more apt to speak, and we think about sometimes domestic students more than international, how do we create a more inclusive classroom?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the discussions we're having here at BU Law. One of the first things I did when I came in was appoint an associate dean for equity, justice, and engagement. And that person was really tasked, one of their major tasks was to really deal with issues that were arising in the classroom. So number one, are there ways that we can get faculty to incorporate many of the issues that Dean Aiken had talked about in their classroom? It's really important for us and for us as leaders to make sure that our students leave law schools, culturally competent, culturally humble, and able to represent a broad range of people and also able to interact with a broad range of people. And so this person does things from speaking with people before they do a new course prep. We know how faculty can be once they have a course prepped, they're less reluctant to change and think about how do they incorporate issues of race and gender and sexuality and class into their courses, but really talking to them before they do that, but also getting groups of faculty who teach the same course together to get together and talk about how do they incorporate these issues, and they can learn from each other in terms of how do you bring these issues into the classroom, having training sessions on how do you handle a difficult topic or a difficult question or sensitive topics in the classroom. Because a lot of faculty, it's not that they don't want to do this, but it's that they feel completely unqualified to do it. They don't feel comfortable. They worry about what if they mess something up. And I think part of them being an example for students too is that we all mess things up. We all say the wrong thing. We all do the wrong thing at some point. And really the question is, how do you respond and how do you learn from it? And how can you bring it to your practice in a way that enables you to better serve your client and that enables you to better serve your community as somebody who's going to be a leader in your community as a lawyer. And so we've really been with grappling with one of those issues. I think very much tied to that is actually the diversity of the faculty. So making sure that you're recruiting and retaining a diverse faculty. Other things that can be done are sort of bookmarks or a list of things that people can do to make their classroom more inclusive, right? Waiting a few minutes instead of taking the first few hands that fly up. It's more likely to increase participation from women in the classroom. One thing that I'd gone for years and years and years, and honestly, I hadn't even thought about a couple years ago, and some professors are gonna really be upset that I even say this, but I mean, thinking about, even what edition of the casebook you use. You don't always have to use the latest edition of a casebook, but if you use the second to latest edition of a casebook, you've offered your students a cheaper option, right? So we have some students who go without casebooks if they're using only the ones in the library, but if you use an older edition and use edited cases, you provide them with a way to get a cheaper casebook online. So just being even more aware of some of the economic challenges that students may face, including in places like Boston, which are more expensive. But I think it's really just you have to take them head on and have open discussions about them and present people with these issues. Because I think faculty, just because they're faculty, doesn't mean that they know and understand and are aware of their own biases or their own blinders or about issues of race and gender and how to handle tough discussions or how to incorporate them into their class. And so they, just like students, need to learn. And I think that's something that deans can do. And then obviously at the student level, deans can encourage that same kind of inclusive and understanding environment. Having there be a cultural competency component that students have to complete at some point. Having students go through implicit bias training, whether it be in orientation or other times. And really, the research shows that it can't just be a one-time thing. It has to happen over and over. But I think completely introducing people to these things and encouraging people to engage in really critical and difficult conversations.
Yeah, wonderful answer. Lots of parts to that. And Dean Aiken, I saw you nodding probably the most, although everybody was nodding. So let's ask you for some comments on what a dean can do.
Well, I think a dean can take this on as one of the things we do for our faculty is to give them tools to help them be better at addressing these issues, to encourage them to address these issues, to think about ways they can make their classrooms more inclusive. One of the things that I always do is I ask students to take a moment before they answer the question, or to turn to a party, to their fellow student and to have a conversation about it, just to not just privilege those who are immediately able to answer a question. And that sometimes, particularly with sensitive issues like this, can make the room operate much better. And so teaching our faculty about little simple things they can do in a classroom that will help them not just be the teacher, but the facilitator. And that will help the conversation be richer, and it's less frightening for the faculty member as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Dean Goluboff, when you have gone to, say, junior colleagues' classrooms to do an observation, say a tenure promotion, have there been things that you've observed at times about making a classroom more inclusive? The pattern of people how we call on students, who we call on, what type of follow-up? Have there been times when you've given advice to more junior faculty about questioning in the classroom or classroom dynamics?
So I wouldn't say this is specific to any particular junior or my own observations, but certainly we do teaching workshops for our juniors before they start teaching, and obviously do evaluations, pre-tenure. And I always talk about myself as a teacher as always on a relentless quest for full participation. That's my goal. Everyone in the class should talk. In my ideal world, everyone talks all the time, as much as they possibly can. And so we do a lot of the same kinds of workshops and trainings for all of our faculty. But in particular, with the junior faculty, I often share ideas like Dean Aiken mentioned of, alternative pedagogical tools. So if you notice that the same people are raising your hand, maybe you ask a question, you say, everyone take a minute and write down an answer. And then then you'll raise your hands and I'll call on people. So you give people more time, or you have them break up in groups. Sometimes I'll have, if I notice that I always in my own classes have a cold call list, but that's more on the black letter law, and then I take volunteers for a discussion. But when I notice that's being dominated by particular people, I'll then have a separate cold call list for the discussion part, right? And really trying to draw people out. In smaller classes, I often will suggest to my junior colleagues, in a seminar or something like that, having response papers so that people have to have written something before they walk in the room and shared it with you or with the other members of the class, that it's not just that they've done the reading, but they have a formulated thought about what it is they want to say. And so it's less scary to then say it, or having a question where you go around the room and you have everyone answer the question to begin the conversation. Because I often think the hardest part is for people to speak the first time. So if you can get people to speak once and realize it's going to be okay, you can get them to speak a second time. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of advice I give to junior colleagues is to encourage those who do speak regularly to be aware of the dynamics and not to speak as much, right? So to say, if you're a person who regularly speaks and you notice someone who doesn't always speak trying to get in, pull back, don't raise your hand, defer to them, right? So making sure that people have a sense of who they are in the classroom and that the faculty member feels comfortable kind of raising to the to the text, not just to the subtext, who speaks and who doesn't speak, and making sure that people see it as their jobs to enable their colleagues to speak, and not always to put the burden on particular people. Although you want to, of course, stay away from saying, oh, well, you're a person of this type, therefore you should be the spokesperson. I don't mean that. Right. I just mean being aware of the dynamics as they go, as they develop in a classroom.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Just some good collaboration, listening skills. And I know when we first started doing some online education, and we would do particularly synchronous, we would have faculty who thought that there was more of a diversity of discussion in an online setting. People felt more ready to talk, a little bit at times even they had more anonymity, which is interesting. So you can probably bring in some technology to help as well. We're almost out of time, and I know some of our deans have really hard stops at the top of the hour. So we're going to ask each dean to maybe just give us a 30 to 45-second wrap up, anything that you think we might have missed. And Dean Lawson, we'll start with you.
Okay, I would just add in the follow-up to some of the last comments that as deans of the law school, we can also be leaders in the university, in the larger university, to broaden the conversation as it relates to diversity and inclusion and bring all the faculty together in different ways to address the various learning styles of our student bodies, particularly when we're trying to favor access and inclusion and students feeling comfortable to learn and excel in our home institutions.
Great, thank you, Tamara. Wonderful comments. Risa?
Yeah, I would say there's so much to say, but I guess I'll say this one thing. I've been in conversations where people talk about diversity and inclusion, and they say, diversity is when you're asked to the dance, and inclusion is when you're asked to dance. And I always get sad when I think about that because it doesn't go nearly far enough, right? It still assumes there are insiders and outsiders. The insiders have decided there's going to be a dance. The insiders decide who gets to dance, and then they invite the outsiders to do so. And so the word I really like to use is belonging or ownership, because I think you want to make sure that every member of your community feels entitled to say, hey, are we going to have a dance, or are we going to have a bingo night, right? What are we going to do? And to feel that they're thriving as a whole person in your institution is of paramount importance. They get to bring their whole self. You value them for their whole self, and that every person in your institution shares equally in that sense of ownership over the institution and its destiny.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful metaphor. Thank you, Risa. Dean Aiken?
Here, here.
That was good and concise, good ending. And Dean Willig, you then have the final comments.
I guess I would say is that one of the things I've learned in this job is how important embodied diversity is. For many of the reasons that have been brought out here, even as somebody who studies diversity and inclusion and equity, I was really surprised by how important it was for so many people that I was in this particular position. But it's the embodied diversity matters for that as well. But it also matters because I do think, as Dean Aiken pointed out earlier, there are different perspectives and different questions and different ideas that are raised when women and people of color are in leadership positions. And so I would really just encourage everyone out there is to really not, really push for things that you want. It's important for women and people of color to be in leadership positions and in decision-making positions. And I would encourage people to seek them out for all those reasons. And I say this as somebody, I woke up this morning and there was an article about challenges to gender STEM programs that were designed to encourage young girls to think about the sciences. We live in this really weird, sort of weird world now where there is sort of this backlash, not even to just talking about being asked to dance or any of those things or making the decisions about it, but really to just coming to the dance at all. And I think it's as I look at those kinds of stories, it becomes more and more important to me that people who are concerned about inclusion and equity should really be in leadership positions. And so I would encourage people to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this leadership group on screen certainly demonstrates that. Kellye, thank you so much. Deans, thank you so much. Wonderful program. Our next Kellye and Ken will be on Monday, September 16, when we address civic education on the day before Constitution Day. Thank everybody, and good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.